The winter of 1946 was not just cold, it was hollow. Germany was a nation stripped to its bones, its chimneys coughing smoke into a sky that no longer remembered song. Women queued with dented tin bowls for thin broth that tasted of defeat. In the market square, a boy of 8 bartered his mother's wedding ring for half a loaf. His hands trembled not from cold, but from the shame of survival. Across the collapsed cities, there were no soldiers left, only widows and daughters. 3 million German men were still held in Allied camps. Another 2 million would never return. The streets belonged to the women now, women who patched roofs, carried bricks, and buried what remained of their youth beneath ration coupons. In Bavaria, the American zone stretched like a promise wrapped in barbed wire. The occupiers brought flour, cigarettes, and something else, an aura of power, humming beneath their clean uniforms and strange laughter. In a bombed-out schoolhouse near the main river, chalk dust mixed with frost. Anna Keller, a 27-year-old teacher, wrote on the board with gloves on, her breath visible as she shaped foreign words: apple, bread, peace. Her students, a cluster of orphans and hollow-eyed girls, repeated them softly, as if afraid the words might vanish. When the lesson ended, she folded her coat around her tightly and walked home past the ruins of the church where she had once been married. Her husband, Friedrich, was buried somewhere in France, under a cross marked unknown soldier. What she carried home each night was not hope, but endurance. That same evening, another woman, Liesel Brandt, 24, stood in a queue outside an American canteen. Her father had been a Nazi party clerk. Her mother, a seamstress who now unstitched uniforms for scraps of cloth. Liesel's beauty had once been her family's pride, but now it was a burden. The GIs whistled when she passed, tossing her gum or chocolate, as if she were a souvenir of victory. She ignored them, clutching her ration card tighter, but hunger softened pride faster than winter softened iron. By March, the American occupation had entered its second year. The Marshall Plan was still only an idea whispered in Washington. In Germany, survival depended on barter. Coffee for soap, soap for bread, bread for cigarettes. But in one corner of Bavaria, an unexpected exchange began: letters for love. It started quietly in a Red Cross office near Nuremberg. Chaplain Robert Hayes, a 40-year-old from Ohio, saw the line of German women begging for news of missing husbands and thought of the lonely GIs stationed nearby. He proposed something unthinkable: let them write to each other. Maybe words can rebuild what bombs destroyed. At first, it was unofficial, hidden behind stacks of relief forms. But soon, letters began to flow. English scrawled in shaky hands, German words wrapped in shy gratitude. Anna wrote her first letter on borrowed paper, addressing it to any American soldier who believes peace can have a face. She told her students her ration of 900 calories a day, and how she had once loved poetry. When she dropped it into the Red Cross box, her fingers lingered as if releasing a part of herself she hadn't known still lived. Liesel refused to write. "We are not beggars," she said, though she slept in an attic without heat. But one night, after seeing her mother trade her wedding dress for potatoes, she sat by candlelight and began. Her letter was simple, proud. "I do not ask for pity, only to know what it feels like to live without fear." She didn't sign her last name. Elsewhere in a nearby village, Greta Voigt, a widow of 32 with 2 young sons, read about the Red Cross correspondence in a church bulletin. She hesitated. Her husband had been conscripted by the Wehrmacht and never returned from the Eastern Front. Greta's world had shrunk to a single goal: feed the children, chop enough wood to last a night. But when her eldest, Carl, asked if America had food, she answered softly, "Maybe they have kindness too." The next morning, she wrote to a soldier named James Tully, whose address she copied from a notice board. Weeks passed. The river thawed. From the barracks outside Bamberg came replies, letters with stamps bearing eagles, ink that smelled faintly of tobacco. The women read them in secret, hiding them between mattress seams or in side hymnals. The Americans wrote about baseball, ration coffee, and hometowns that sounded like fairy tales: Kansas, Ohio, California. They sent photos, clean-shaven smiles, fields of wheat, dogs that looked fat and happy. Anna's soldier, Lieutenant Frank Miller, wrote with surprising gentleness. "We all lost something," he said. "Maybe that's why I can't stop writing to you." Liesel's correspondent, Sergeant Jack Morgan, teased her German grammar and promised to teach her how to dance. Greta's soldier, Corporal Tully, sent a small box of Hershey's bars wrapped in military newspaper. Her son stared at it as if it were gold. By June, the letters had become lifelines. Across the shattered empire, more women joined, their words stitched with equal parts guilt and longing. For them, love was not a dream but a form of recovery, a way to prove they could still be human. Yet not everyone approved. In Munich, leaflets circulated warning that German honor is not for sale. Old loyalties whispered in taverns, accusing the women of betrayal. The women whispered back, "We are not betraying Germany. Germany betrayed us first." The Americans, too, faced resistance. Army command discouraged fraternization, calling it unbecoming of an officer. But young men who had faced death no longer feared scandal. Some visited villages in secret, delivering food parcels from pen pals. When Liesel saw Jack for the first time, he was taller than she imagined and laughed easily, though his eyes carried something broken. He handed her a can of peaches and said, "For your mother, Fräulein." She didn't speak. She only stared at the sunlight on his hair, thinking, he is too alive for this place. In the evenings, church bells rang again, not for weddings, but for peace services. Yet within that peace, a quiet revolution stirred. Letters turned into promises, promises into proposals. The American command called it marriage diplomacy. Newspapers called it scandal. The women called it salvation. One afternoon, Anna received a letter marked official correspondence. It bore an American seal. Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside was a form, an invitation to a marriage application interview conducted by Allied officers in Frankfurt. Attached was a single photograph. Frank Miller, standing beside a jeep, smiling in sunlight that looked warmer than anything she'd known. Outside her window, the snow had melted, leaving streets lined with yellow wildflowers. She touched the photo's edge with trembling fingers. It was the first time in years that her heart beat faster for something other than fear. And somewhere across the ocean, in a military dormitory in Kentucky, Frank folded her letter once more, tracing her handwriting with a soldier's calloused thumb. Neither knew that their letters, born from hunger and ruin, would soon carry them into one of history's strangest unions. The train from Würzburg to Frankfurt clattered like a heartbeat through the thawing countryside, carrying 17 women whose lives had already ended once and were now, perhaps, about to begin again. Steam billowed into the cold morning air, mixing with a faint smell of coal and perfume, an improvised blend of survival and hope. They wore second-hand dresses sewn from curtain fabric, their shoes patched with wire and string. In their hands, each woman clutched an envelope stamped with an American seal, letters of introduction, marriage approvals, and the kind of promises that only peace can dare make. Inside the carriage, laughter rose and fell like waves breaking on ruins. One woman had drawn lipstick from a crushed tube, coloring her lips with trembling pride. Another hid a rosary beneath her collar, whispering that God would forgive her for marrying the enemy. Anna Keller sat by the window, tracing frost on the glass as the landscape slid past. Villages without steeples, fields littered with the bones of burned tanks, a horizon that still smelled faintly of smoke. Beside her, Greta's 2 sons slept, their small faces pressed into her lap. Liesel Brandt, the youngest among them, leaned against the window frame and stared at her reflection as if trying to remember what beauty used to mean. The war was over, but Germany was not at peace with itself. Every mile of track they crossed carried ghosts of lost husbands, of promises made to nations that no longer existed. Yet in Frankfurt, something remarkable awaited, an experiment of reconciliation disguised as romance. The U.S. military government called it the Cross-Cultural Marriage Registration Program, though locals whispered another name, the Bride Parade. When the women arrived, they were escorted through a former officer's barracks turned into a screening center. The building still bore the smell of diesel and sweat. American clerks shuffled paperwork, while translators read out questions. Do you understand the nature of this marriage? Have you had political affiliations with the Nazi Party? Are you entering this union freely? Each answer was recorded in triplicate. Anna spoke carefully. Her voice steadied though her stomach churned. Yes, I understand. No, I was not a party member. Yes, I consent. Her English was slow, but clear. Across the desk, a lieutenant nodded, stamping her form with a blue seal of approval. Behind her, Greta stood with her sons, answering through a translator. She says she seeks a father for them. The translator explained. Greta flushed with shame, but didn't look away. Liesel, in her turn, crossed her arms when asked why she wished to marry an American. Because German men are all ghosts, she said bluntly. The clerk blinked, then marked her form cleared for interview. In the courtyard outside, a gramophone crackled with an American tune. Bing Crosby singing It's Been a Long, Long Time. The melody floated through the spring air as the brides lined up, each holding their papers like passports to another life. Beyond the gates, trucks arrived one after another, bringing the men they had written to for months. Soldiers in crisp uniforms, polished boots, and nervous smiles. They stepped down from the trucks as if entering a dream they didn't quite believe in. For the women, the sight was disorienting. These men were taller than imagined, healthier, their eyes filled with easy humor foreign to a country rebuilt on silence. Liesel clutched her purse to still her shaking hands. Anna's breath caught when she saw Frank Miller stepping toward her, hat in hand, sunlight glancing off his metal ribbons. He looked younger than she expected, but there was a weariness in his posture that matched her own. When he spoke, Miss Keller? His accent turned her name into something almost tender. She nodded, unable to speak. Nearby, Greta met James Tully, the corporal who had sent chocolate for her boys. He bent down to greet them first, offering a stick of gum. Chew it slow, he said, smiling. Greta watched his rough hands and thought, he has built things, not broken them. Liesel's match, Sergeant Jack Morgan, approached with the confident swagger of a man who had survived everything once already. So, you're my Fräulein pen pal, he said, grinning. She looked him over, unimpressed. I was a teacher, she replied, not a souvenir. His grin faltered, then softened into respect. Inside the hall, translators guided hesitant introductions. Some couples laughed easily. Others stood in silence, exchanging glances that spoke of fear as much as fascination. American photographers snapped pictures for newspapers back home. G.I. Mary's former enemy. The irony was lost on none of them. For the soldiers, these women represented forgiveness. For the women, the soldiers represented survival. That night, a dinner was held in a requisitioned ballroom. Long tables gleamed under dim bulbs. Powdered potatoes steamed beside tins of corned beef. For most of the women, it was the first full meal they'd had in years. Yet appetite mixed with unease. Laughter echoed from one end of the hall. But at another, a woman quietly wept into her napkin. A band played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Couples were encouraged to dance. Some did, awkwardly, stiffly, feet moving like they'd forgotten how to be free. Frank extended his hand toward Anna. May I? She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. The music swelled. He moved carefully, aware of the gulf between them. I used to dance before the war, she said softly. Then everything stopped. Frank nodded. It stopped for me, too. They turned slowly beneath the flickering light, two strangers orbiting the memory of what life once was. At another table, Liesel sipped water wine, watching Jack charm a group of officers. When he caught her eye, he raised his glass, half teasing. She almost smiled. Across the room, Greta tucked her sons into borrowed cots beside the wall, whispering, Sleep, little wolves. Tomorrow we meet your new home. By midnight, the ballroom had quieted. Some couples exchanged addresses, others just handshakes. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and persistent, tapping against the windows like cautious applause. Anna stepped into the corridor, where Frank waited, holding her coat. It's strange, he said. I thought this would feel like an ending. It feels like something else. She met his gaze, the corridor light casting long shadows behind them. It feels like beginning from ruins, she murmured. In the days that followed, Newspapers in both countries printed photographs of the event. American readers saw romance. Germans saw betrayal. Church leaders warned of moral decay, while soldiers' mothers wrote angry letters to editors. But the couples themselves carried on quietly, walking hand in hand through cities still half rubble, half resurrection. When the time came for the brides to leave, each received a passport bearing a new title, wife of a U.S. citizen. The train waited under a pale sky, steam rising like ghostly confetti. Anna held Frank's arm. Liesel stared out at the empty platform. Greta clutched her boys close as James lifted their suitcase. As the whistle blew, a hush fell over the crowd. None of them could have known that their departures would be recorded not as romance, but as the first great migration of forgiveness in modern history. The train lurched forward, wheels shrieking against the rails, carrying 17 women away from the ashes of Germany toward a future neither side was ready to imagine. And far behind them, in the quiet town they left behind, whispers began to rise again, questions that no one dared to answer yet. The Atlantic wind screamed against the hull of the USS General Black. Tearing at scarves and letters clutched the chest as the German brides leaned over the rail. The ocean stretched endlessly, black and white beneath the winter sky, as it still divided between war and peace. Anna gripped the railing until her knuckles turned pale, watching the coastline of Europe dissolve into mist. Behind her, Greta tried to calm her sons, who were both thrilled and terrified of the ship's motion. Liesel stood apart, arms folded, her eyes on the horizon. None of them spoke. They were leaving not just a continent, but a version of themselves that history had already burned away. Below deck, the air was thick with salt, oil, and the hum of engines. The bride slept in narrow bunks. Each woman, clutching the envelope that made her a legal passenger, wore a bride visa. Section 13 of the U.S. Immigration Act. The hum of the ship became a lullaby, a constant reminder that they were being carried by American machinery now. Somewhere above them, U.S. officers smoked and laughed, while sailors told stories about girls waiting in Kansas or Ohio. Down here, the German women whispered about ration cards, bomb shelters, and the taste of ersatz coffee. For them, love had always begun in silence. On the sixth night, Anna found herself unable to sleep. She climbed the metal stairs to the deck. Where Frank stood in uniform, collar turned up against the cold. The sea sprayed silver across his coat. "Still awake?" he asked, voice soft beneath the wind. She nodded. "It doesn't feel real," she said, "to leave one world and step into another." He smiled faintly. That's what the war was supposed to do. In one world, start another. His tone carried neither pride nor regret, only fatigue. For a moment, they stood together, two survivors adrift between continents, unsure which direction meant home. When the Statue of Liberty finally rose in the fog, the ship erupted in gasps and sobs. Children cheered. Women pressed their faces to the railings, crying openly. Even Liesel's lips parted in disbelief. The skyline of New York shimmered, towers of glass catching sunlight like promises. On the pier below, American families waved flags, camera flashes cutting through the mist. It was a cinematic arrival, orchestrated by history itself. Yet beneath the spectacle was a quieter truth. They were still strangers in someone else's dream. At Ellis Island, immigration officers processed them with brisk efficiency. Names mispronounced, papers stamped, questions repeated. Occupation, wife, religion, Protestant or Catholic, sir. Any relatives in the United States? Only him. The word "him" carried both fear and hope. Greta's boys were given small American flags and candy by a Red Cross worker, who smiled kindly but kept her distance. Liesel caught a woman whispering, "They're all German," as if it explained everything. Frank took Anna by the hand when they stepped into the sunlight outside. "Welcome to America," he said. The words were warm, but the air felt foreign. The smell of gasoline, roasted peanuts, and new leather filling her lungs. She had imagined America in colors softer than this, not the glare of advertisements and hurried footsteps. They boarded a train heading west, toward Frank's hometown in Kentucky. Through the window, she watched endless fields flash by, dotted with barns and grazing cattle. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's ordinary," Frank replied. Then, after a pause, "That's what I missed. For Greta, the transition was gentler but lonelier. James's family in Missouri welcomed her politely. Yet behind every smile lingered curiosity, the kind reserved for museum exhibits. At church, the pastor praised Christian charity, while avoiding the word Germany. Greta spent her first weeks memorizing grocery items and measuring cups, stunned by abundance. Butter, sugar, flour, each more precious than gold in her memory. Still, when night came and James slept, she would sit by the window and stare at the stars, whispering to the ghosts of her old world. Liesl arrived in Chicago with Jack, stepping into a small apartment above a diner. The noise of the city overwhelmed her. Streetcars screeching, jazz leaking from every window. Jack taught her to fry eggs, to tip waitresses, to smile when people stared. "They don't mean harm," he said once, when she caught a woman glaring at her accent. "They just don't know what you've been through." Liesl smiled tightly. "Neither do you," she said. That night, he found her sitting in the dark, translating one of her old letters from German to English. "So I can learn how to speak like someone who isn't afraid," she explained. In the months that followed, the war brides became curiosities in their neighborhoods. Newspapers ran stories about them. Former enemy women find new lives as American wives. Some readers sent congratulations. Others sent hate mail. Anna's mailbox filled with both. One letter read, "Our boys died fighting her kind. Now she lives next door." She didn't show Frank, but he found it anyway, tucked beneath a cookbook. He tore it up and threw it into the fire. "They'll learn," he muttered. She watched the ashes curl and thought her classroom in Würzburg of chalked dust and ruined windows. "Or they won't," she said. There were small mercies, too. The brides formed quiet circles, coffee gatherings in kitchens, letters exchanged between states. They shared recipes, practiced English, taught their children lullabies from the old country. Slowly, suspicion gave way to curiosity. Neighbors began to ask for strudel recipes. Churches hosted friendship Sundays. Children grew up bilingual, their laughter a living peace treaty. Still, not all wounds healed. Greta once overheard James's father muttering, "Never thought I'd see the day a German woman raise my grandkids." She smiled politely at breakfast, but her hands shook when she poured milk. Anna's husband sometimes woke, screaming from dreams of Normandy. She would hold him until dawn, whispering, "You came home. You came home." Liesl fought her battles in silence, correcting every insult with flawless English until no one could mistake her for an outsider again. By 1949, their stories had spread across America. Congress reported over 70,000 war brides arriving from Europe, 14,000 from Germany alone. Some settled into contentment. Others divorced quietly, disappearing into anonymity. But the idea of love transcending war took root, reshaping post-war diplomacy more deeply than speeches ever could. One evening, as summer light faded over Kentucky hills, Anna walked barefoot through Frank's garden. Fireflies drifted between rows of corn, glowing like small, forgiving souls. Frank joined her, his hands still calloused from farm work. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. She looked up at the stars, remembering the smoke above Würzburg. "No," she said, "but I remember everything." Inside the house, the radio played a broadcast about a New World conflict brewing in Korea. The commentator's voice carried the same urgency she'd heard once before, years ago. Anna turned it off, unwilling to let another war steal her quiet. She stood by the window as fireflies flickered against the glass. The reflection that stared back was not a refugee or an enemy, but something simpler, a woman who had crossed an ocean of memory and found, at last, the shore. Yet even in peace, history waited. Letters arrived from Europe, full of longing and guilt, stories of brothers still missing, mothers still hungry. Anna read them under the same lamp that had once illuminated her lessons in German. And one night, a letter came bearing no return address, only a sentence written in shaky English. "Not all forgive, not all forget." She folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer beside Frank's medals, and blew out the light. The sea outside her dreams began to rise again. By the mid-1950s, The echoes of war had faded into the static of radio broadcasts and the rhythm of new lives being built. America had moved on. Televisions glowed in living rooms, cars lined suburban driveways, and children who had never seen Europe played under skies that had never known bombers. Yet, for the German war brides, the past was never entirely gone. It lived quietly in accents softened but never erased, in recipes made from memory, and in the faces of children who looked like both sides of a war the world tried to forget. Anna Keller Miller stood on her Kentucky porch one humid evening, watching her daughter chase fireflies across the yard. The air smelled of honeysuckle and hay. Frank had traded his uniform for work boots, his medals tucked in a drawer beside her letters from Würzburg. Neighbors no longer whispered when she passed in town, though sometimes an old man would pause too long before greeting her, as if still measuring her against the ghost of an enemy. Yet life, like the tide, had pulled everyone forward. The school now called her Mrs. Miller, and when she corrected her students' English, no one heard the trace of her German vowels anymore. Greta lived further west in Missouri, where her husband James ran a hardware store. Her boys, now lanky teenagers, spoke English with Midwestern drawl and only understood German when she sang lullabies. She no longer wore black for mourning. Instead, she wore cotton dresses and laughter. But sometimes, when she watched her sons playing baseball, she would think of the children she used to teach in the church basement back in Bavaria. Children who vanished into orphan trains and rubble. At night, she prayed in two languages, unsure which God listened more kindly. Liesel had become a secretary in Chicago. Her English was crisp, her hair shorter, her smile sharper. She and Jack had built a life of motion, music, work, friends who didn't ask about the past. Yet there were cracks between them that neither admitted to. Jack still had nightmares that made him sweat through the sheets, and she sometimes caught herself counting in German when frightened. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a single act but a daily choice, a discipline. Across America, thousands of German brides lived similar contradictions. They were housewives and mothers, church volunteers and PTA presidents, yet their foreignness lingered, subtle as perfume. Newspapers had stopped calling them Nazi wives and started calling them ambassadors of peace. Historians later estimated that by 1955, 1 in 5 German American war marriages had failed, but the rest endured, quietly, stubbornly, like flowers blooming through concrete. One autumn afternoon, Anna received a letter from Würzburg. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It was from her former student, Clara, now a teacher herself. "Your name is still spoken here," it read. The school was rebuilt. The children remember the songs you taught them. Enclosed was a faded photograph. The same schoolyard, now filled with smiling faces. Anna pressed it to her chest, feeling something close to peace, though not quite. She had forgiven, yes, but she hadn't forgotten. That winter, Frank suggested a trip back to Germany. "You've earned it," he said. "It's time you saw it as something other than rubble." She hesitated, afraid of seeing what she'd lost, or worse, seeing it rebuilt without her. But by spring of 1958, she agreed. They boarded a Pan-American flight from New York, their daughter asleep between them, her small hand clutching a teddy bear made in Ohio. From the air, Germany looked healed. Green fields, red rooftops, new churches where ruins once stood. But as soon as Anna stepped onto Bavarian soil, the smell of coal dust and rain stirred old ghosts. In Würzburg, the streets were clean, the windows gleamed, but she felt the weight of memory pressing behind every corner. At the schoolhouse, a gray-haired janitor recognized her instantly. "Fräulein Keller," he whispered, eyes wet. "You came home." She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "I came to remember." Meanwhile, Greta faced her own reckoning. One of her sons, now 16, had joined the U.S. Army Reserve. When he put on his uniform for the first time, she felt a chill, pride tangled with dread. "It's different now, Mama," he said, hugging her. "We're the good guys." She smiled, but that night she dreamed of trains again, of departures that promised safety and delivered loss. Liesel's confrontation came more abruptly. Jack had been invited to a veterans' reunion, and she went with him, wearing a navy dress and pearls. The hall buzzed with laughter and nostalgia. But when a man at their table learned she was German, his face hardened. "My brother died at Bastogne," he said coldly. "I suppose your people sent the bullets." The air froze. Liesel held his gaze. "And my husband sent the forgiveness," she replied. The man looked away, shame softening his anger. Later that night, Jack kissed her hand in the cab home and whispered, "You shouldn't have to fight anymore." She smiled faintly. We all keep fighting something. As the decade closed, the world changed again. The Cold War drew new borders. America found new enemies. The children of the war brides grew up watching rockets instead of ration lines. History shifted, and the sins of their mothers' homelands faded into textbooks. Yet the bride's quiet legacy remained, and the way they turned suspicion into empathy, and how they built bridges not with treaties, but with dinners, laughter, and love. Anna's daughter, now in high school, once asked why her mother's accent sometimes grew thicker when she was tired. Anna smiled. "Because memory is a language you never forget." The girl tilted her head. "Do you miss Germany?" "I miss who I was there," Anna said softly. "But I wouldn't trade who I became." Years later, at a local history event, a journalist interviewed Anna, Greta, and Liesel for an article about war brides who changed America. They sat together on a porch, sipping iced tea, watching children play in the yard. "Do you ever regret it?" the reporter asked. Greta shook her head. "Regret means you wish for another life. I only wish for peace." Liesel laughed gently, and found it the hard way. Anna looked at the setting sun and said, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to see a face instead of flag." The article ran with their photograph, a black and white image of three women smiling beneath an American sky. Readers saw warmth, resilience, beauty. Few noticed the shadows in their eyes, the quiet knowledge that peace is never simple, only earned. That night, as Anna folded laundry in her quiet house, she paused to look at the photo again. Her reflection overlapped her younger self in the glass. Two versions meeting across time. Outside, cicadas hummed their endless chorus, and the world seemed at last to have exhaled. Then came the faint sound of a mail truck down the lane. Another letter slid to the slot, addressed in careful, uncertain handwriting. From Würzburg School, class of 1946. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single line, written by a former pupil now grown old. "Thank you for teaching us words again, when the world had forgotten how to speak." Anna pressed her fingers to the paper, her eyes filling. She stood there in the quiet room, surrounded by the hum of a nation that had once been her enemy and was now her home. Outside, her daughter's laughter carried through the dusk, and Anna smiled, because in that sound the war at last was over.